The hard part about working out of my truck is knowing exactly what I'm going to need for the day. So I load up what I think I can get done. The reality is I only get one of or two of the projects out of the 3 or 4 that I have in mind. It's not so much a time management thing as much as it just takes a little longer for all the metal prep. So here's what I brought today. You can see my truck is full of metal, and actually there's enough metal in here for approximately 4 or 5 projects. The worst is when you're working on something and then all of a sudden you realize you don't have what you need. So the last time I was at Schoolcraft, I bent a bunch of rod. I'm doing a whole series of bent rod sculptures, and I just bent till my heart was desired, and who knows what can come of it. Okay, so I've settled on a design, starting with this 45-degree angle cut pipe, and then I'm going to accent it with this horizontal cut pipe, and then what I'll do is I will weld this as if it's coming out of the center of the eye on an angle, and then jutting from that, I will use some pre-bent metal that will be looks as though it's rolling off that center piece into a kind of a smoke signal. And then I will add these other 2 elements, again to give it some dimension. And at the end, it'll be probably about a 32-inch sculpture. But now what I'm going to do is prep the metal. Since I plan on powder coating this piece, I'm going to sandblast it. And I'll try to get rid of the coating on this with sandblast. If not, I'm going to have to do some grinding. The reason for that is I will be powder coating this with probably a translucent powder coat, which will give it a little more movement and dimension. Okay, we finished the process of sandblasting, and you can see the sand dust. You don't want to necessarily breathe that in, so I'm letting it settle a little bit. But you can see that there's definitely a difference in the metal once it's sandblasted, although I missed a few pieces. This particular sandblaster was definitely on its best performance today, but as you can see, you can't really see too much through the window. So a lot of the sandblasting process is done through sound and the actual feeling of the gun and the sand hitting the metal. So in some cases it's not as perfect as you'd like it to be. I can go back in and clean that up with more sand, or I can do some grinding. Because I'm going to do translucent powder coating on this, I am going to do some grinding on it to provide those that dimension. I'm going to start cleaning up on the grinding right now. I'm here at the Village Workshop, and they provide some of the equipment. I provide the consumable, the flapper. I prefer these flappers over the flat discs only because I have a tendency to catch the flat disc and then it flies. And I just noticed I have nice blackness on my nose, which is a condition of welding. You get pretty dirty. All right, so let's start the grinding. Okay, let's get started. I've already pre-grinded this one piece I want to share with you here. I didn't go too deep, I just shined up the outside because I think that will help with the translucent powder coat finish. And I left the grind marks, or the cut marks, if you will, off the horizontal saw, again for some interest on the surface. It's interesting, steel is actually very porous and pliable. It's easy to grind, scratch, and pit. And the outside of this, because this pipe was rusted, has some pitting in it where the rust or the iron oxide actually eroded a little bit of the finish away, which I, of course, like because, again, that adds more dimension. It's interesting. I think many of us who were raised with Superman as the Man of Steel believe that steel was impenetrable, when actually it's a very pliable medium to work with. So let's get started on this one here. Okay, so the pieces have been grinded, and I want to talk a little bit about grinding, because to me, grinding is like putting the grain into the wood. So metal is very flat, right? But by using different strokes of grinding, you see how the light is catching this grind right here. It creates a little more elegance and motion to the actual bend. And that is provided by the grind. I mean, you could actually even see the wheel marks in it. Now, that was done by choice because I want to see those grind marks. I want to add that extra layer of dimension to the piece. I have made the mistake of not prepping and grinding prior to welding the metal. And honestly, that is an overall mistake. It does affect the final finish, especially if you're trying to do something quite contemporary, because your grind wheel can't necessarily get into all the nooks and crannies, and nor can you get the angle correctly. At the end of the day, this is a pretty decent sized piece of machinery, and when you're trying to get inside different crevices, it could be difficult to get the grind you like. So I most likely will touch this up when the final piece is welded together, just to make sure all the grind marks are going in the right direction. But I wanted to talk a little bit about grinding and its impact it can have on the final piece. Okay, so let's talk briefly about the actual welding process. I'm going to weld this piece together that I've been working on, and the welding units that they have here at the Village Workshop are Miller units. It's actually all I've worked on before. I'm using a MIG machine for this, and the mix of gas is argon and carbon dioxide, and you can see it right there in the tank. We keep the pressure here, it's already pre-marked for you, at about 30 pounds, and so I'll just open up the tank and make sure that my settings are ready to go. In all welding, it's sometimes good to do a sample test, especially when you're going to do some spot welds. You want to avoid as much spitting as possible and burning, because you want the weld to look nice and neat. And again, getting to know your machine, that's also helpful. So I'm going to do some sample welds before I weld on the piece, make sure I get a nice clean weld. So this is totally why you test your welds. Someone had turned off the argon gas on this machine. Sometimes people leave it on, sometimes people turn down the valve. So in this situation, it was turned down and not set at 30. And so I did my test welds, and I'll show you what those look like. So you can see the first two without the gas. Now, wouldn't that have been a bummer if I did that on the piece? And then the third weld, and then the fourth weld. So I have very little splatter on it. It's a nice little bead. This is 1/8 inch. I use my handy dandy little Miller measurer. So it's the same depth of metal that I'll be welding. So I know my settings are good. So I'll be welding at 20 volts. By wire speed of 202. All of my metal is repurposed or recycled, so therefore this particular metal is a little wider than the piece that I cut. Now, if I had the ability to cut my metal and bend my metal as I'm making it, I can make this more exact. Because I don't have my own workshop and I have to pre-do a lot of the work without having the final design in mind, it makes, sometimes I have to compromise and do a little more grinding. I'm very much an intuitive artist and don't plan out as well as I could. That's not one of my strengths. My strength is more just being intuitive and going with the flow. So this is the first weld where I'm welding the the first centerpiece onto part of the base. I did this first because I want the piece to look as though it's unwinding into this strip of metal. So what I'll do now is I'm going to clean this up with some grinding so that it again looks contiguous. So here's the grinded down piece. So in many cases, like I said in my earlier segment, metal is very pliable. So in a sense, by just using a grinder when I connected these two pieces, in a sense it's almost like sculpting the metal with a grinding tool to make it look like it's one piece rolling off this particular ring. So the next part of the process is I've got my base established and my first smoke swirl, if you will. And now it's just taking the other pieces and finding what I think is aesthetically pleasing in adding it to this piece. So, well, I'll start with this piece first. And again, trying to keep the base of the weight of the metal centered, I'll just kind of move this around until I find what I think I like. I think I kind of like it up high here, which means that my other piece is going to need to be in the center some way. So I'll hold that there and then take my other piece and figure out where I think that might look good. So I'm thinking something in this arena right here. So I'll play around with it a little bit more and figure out what looks. And then what I'll do is I'll use just a real light tack weld to hold it in place, and then step back and get a nice 360 look to make sure that it's balanced, and most importantly that the negative space between the metal is aesthetically pleasing. Where I think I like the piece, and I want to show you how this was one of my original tack welds right here. Now I'll just be able to grind that down so you won't even know that tack weld was there. And then because I do a tack weld, what it allows me to do is to move the metal. It's not like a permanent fixture. So the weld is very light and I can break it off with my hand. And that allows me to work freely with a MIG welder. If I were to use TIG or another process, I wouldn't be able to be so free with my sculptures. So here's, and this isn't necessarily the front, but I'm really liking just that very organic swirl of a negative space that it's creating. It almost looks like animals dancing together in a spin of some kind. I'm really liking this look. And I think once I get the powder coat on it and the finish, it'll be even more impactful. So let's go ahead and finish and tighten up those welds and get the final grind. Okay, so this is the first piece done in the series. It's grinded to a level of character that I like, and I think it looks aesthetically pleasing from all angles. So where the new owner of this, whoever that might be, will discover what they think is the front based on what they see in the sculpture. That's kind of the best thing about doing abstract work is I might see something like I mentioned, I see dancers, but someone else might see something else, and that's what makes the piece unique and personal for each individual art collector. Thanks for joining me today. When I powder coat this in a couple of weeks, I'll share the finished look. Take care.